Welcome everyone, this is Zach with the events team at SEIA, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Do You Believe in Miracles? What's in the Inflation Reduction Act and Next Steps? The Solar Energy Industries Association is leading the transformation to a clean energy economy, creating the framework for solar to achieve 30% of US electricity generation by 2030. SEIA works with its 1,000 member companies and other strategic partners to fight for policies that create jobs in every community and shape fair market rules that promote competition and the growth of reliable, low-cost solar power. Founded in 1974, SEIA is a national trade association building a comprehensive vision for the Solar Plus decade through research, education, and advocacy. Thank you for your continued support. If you have any questions or needs, please contact the SEIA membership team by emailing membership@seia.org. Please note that all listeners will be muted during this call. However, participants may submit questions for a Q&A session following the presentation. For the Q&A portion of this webinar, you may type your question to the panelists into the chat box located within the black navigation bar on your screen anytime. We will try to answer as many questions as we can. After this webinar, participants can expect to receive a copy of the recording and link to today's presentation in a follow-up email in the coming days. I will now pass it off to SEIA's President and CEO, Abby Hopper, to begin today's webinar. Abby.
Great, Zach, thank you so much, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you. I'm Abby Hopper. I'm the CEO of SEIA. I happen to be on vacation this week, which is why you got me in a ponytail and a sundress instead of work attire. Several of my colleagues are also on vacation, but obviously we have been working around the clock this week to understand what's happening and make sure you have all the information you need. So we're going to quickly get to the details of this, but I just want to set the stage, both historically, sort of what has happened over the past 8 or 9 months, and then most importantly, what we still have left to do. So if you do believe in miracles, and some days it does feel like I keep pinching myself, is this really happening? It is happening, but it has far from happened yet. And so if you take nothing else from this webinar, take this. We need to finish this fight. We are not done. A bill has not been signed. And so it is way too early to celebrate. We can certainly be grateful for where we are, and we can acknowledge the progress that is made, and we can talk about what's in here, but we're far, far, far from done. So I'm just going to take us back. I could take us back 8 years, I could take us back 5 years, I could take us back a year, but I'm going to take us back to late December of 2021. Those of you that have been following this very closely may remember that day. There was a conversation around reconciliation, and we've been all working hard on it. I lobbied side by side with many of you. I talked with you over Zoom. We'd had webinars like this. There was this incredible piece of legislation that had passed out of the House of Representatives that had a number of things that we all had worked so hard to get. And it was almost surreal to think, wow, this is within our grasp. And I remember where I was and what I was doing when I heard that wasn't going to happen. Senator Manchin announced that he was not going to be supporting that bill in its current form. It happened right before Christmas. For those of us that celebrate Christmas, it was a rough way to go into the end of the year. And here at SEIA, we took a breath, and we, like many of you, kind of tried to figure out what to do next. But that wasn't the only thing that was happening in our industry. We were in the middle of litigation around the Section 201 extension proceeding. We were dealing with seizures at the border because of the WRO. The Department of Commerce in November had dismissed the anonymous Oxen petition, if you recall. And so we started 2022 with kind of a number of challenges and barriers in our way. And that hasn't really changed, right? We do a quarterly report of what has been both built in the past quarter and how our forecasts are evolving. And over 2022, what we have seen is that the solar industry has been on the decline. Prices have gone up, installations have gone down, and that has been really challenging. That is because there's a number of reasons for that. one that happened in 2022. I remember on Friday, we got the news, we got the news about the Section 201 decision that the president was extending them, but had allowed the bifacial exemption to continue and had increased the quota on cells. And that those are both things that we had advocated for. The following Monday, the Oxen petition was filed. And so it felt like, to me, and I'm sure like many of you, that this was a challenge. Months and months and months of lobbying go by. We're making great progress in the Senate. We have lobby days. I saw many of you in person in Washington. We have letter writing campaigns. Many of you did that. You've organized your companies. You've given to the PAC. I've talked to so many members of Congress. I mean, I don't bother to count because it's just my job. And we have been making so much progress. We most importantly worked really closely with a lot of different partners. Our team will talk a lot about who we worked with. But it felt like sort of there was something within our grasp. And then 2 Thursdays ago, again, I remember exactly where I was and exactly what I was doing. Senator Manchin again announced that he was not going to be voting for the climate package. That was a really rough weekend for all of us at SEIA. I'm sure it was a rough weekend for all of you in the industry, in the solar and storage industry. But by Sunday morning of that weekend, my team and I had decided that we weren't done, right? We were not just going to sort of go home and say, okay, well, I guess it's over. Instead, we said, you know what, there's way too much at stake. We have come way too far. We have negotiated with labor. We have negotiated with the environmental groups. We have negotiated with our own companies. We have negotiated with other technologies. Like, we have come so far and the stakes are way too high. And so we have tried and executed a number of strategies around timing, around the partnerships, around sort of different priorities. And we've made it really clear that we're not going away. We're not going to go quietly into the night, hope for executive action alone. That just was not a possibility. And so it was with great excitement, obviously. Again, I know exactly where I was and what I was doing on Wednesday afternoon. When this news started to break, my team has been literally in the office around the clock, late that night, waiting for the text to come out and then to decipher it. Our consultants that we have on this line, who are experts in the field, have been invaluable in helping us navigate this. And most importantly, our companies, all of you have been incredible partners in making this happen. But huge, huge, huge. We're not done, right? If all we get is a deal and a headline, we're in the same exact place we were 2 weeks ago, right? We don't need a headline. We need a piece of legislation that's been signed by the President of the United States. And so we will not give up until we have that. I hope it takes a week. And I hope that this is a seamless process, but they have no evidence to this point that anything about this will be seamless. And so we're going to ask on that next steps part, we're going to tell you exactly what's in this bill or this act. And but most importantly, we're going to tell you what the next steps are because we need your help. So stay in this fight with us. And with that, I will turn it over to Erin Duncan, our Vice President for Congressional Affairs.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Abby, and welcome everyone to this call. Abby laid the stage for all of us. We are going to divide this webinar up into sections. For the first part, we're going to hear about what's in this legislation. I think it's really important for us to get our arms around what's at stake, as Abby said. Headlines and this good feeling that we allowed ourselves to enjoy for one day is not enough. We have to go and make what you're about to hear a reality, and that involves taking action. You're going to see through the chat, Zach's going to drop in the chat at regular intervals on this call, our action alerts. We are asking you and everyone who works for you, for your family, for anyone you know who cares about clean energy, climate change, and jobs to take action over these next several days. With this deal, we have begun a clock in the United States Senate to get reconciliation, to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed. We've got about at least a week, possibly slightly longer, to make that happen. There are a number of procedural things happening right now in the United States Senate that will allow this deal with all best luck to make it to the floor of the Senate by late next week. In the meantime, it is up to us, myself, my team, you, and every single person you know, to reach out to the United States Senate and tell them why it's critically important that they make this bill a reality in the coming days. And then after that, the United States House of Representatives needs to come back from its August recess, which starts today, and vote to pass this. So we're going to be asking you to take action today. You're going to see additional alerts, most likely from Abby or from other people associated with SEIA over the next week or so, and then possibly continuing, depending how long this takes. If we reach out, I need you to promise that you take action and tell everyone you know to take action. We don't have any room for error here. There are very slim margins in the United States Senate, as we all know, and there's a paper thin margin in the House of Representatives. We have to seal this deal. So with that, let's find out what's in this piece of legislation. And then after we go through our panel, we will take a few questions. But first, I'm going to introduce our panel. With us today is Jeremy Woodrum. He'll be kicking us off. He's the Senior Director of Congressional Affairs for SEIA, and he is our lead on tax issues. And then we're going to hear from John Smirnow, our General Counsel and Vice President of Market Strategy, to talk about the incredible work that he has led on manufacturing development and the victories that are in this legislation related to manufacturing. And then we're going to hear from Justin Baca, who's the Vice President of Markets and Research at SEIA, about the potential impact of the manufacturing credits that are in this legislation. And then finally, we're going to hear from Charles Bolden, our Director of Congressional Affairs, who's going to talk about some of the other very significant programs in this legislation centered around environmental justice, agriculture policy, transmission, and other programs that were included. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to my friend and colleague, Jeremy Woodrum, to kick us off. Jeremy?
Thanks, Erin. Just wait for the PowerPoint here to get going. Okay. So everything, let me just say at the outset, the things I'm going to talk about have to go through a process in the Senate called the bird bath, which is basically an effort to determine whether they are consistent with the rules of the Senate that would allow for legislation to pass with 51 votes instead of 60 votes. So the things in here are not 100% guaranteed to be in the final bill, particularly some of the policy changes. It's a little unclear whether they will make it or not. We just don't know yet, and we won't know until the end. But some of the basic things like ITC extensions, PTC extensions, those are clearly within the bird scope. And so not to say that that means the whole bill gets passed, but those are not going to be a problem with reconciliation. So you might, if you hear me comment on that a little bit throughout, that sort of colors all of everything that's in the bill right now. So at present, the bill text has existing extensions of the ITC through the end of 2024. So any project, and I'm talking about Section 48 here, so commercial projects through the end of 2024. So if you start a project through the end of 2024, you can get the sort of ITC mostly as we know it today. On the left there, pardon me, and then also you will be able to get the PTC for solar. That's not something that's been available as an option for many years. Basically, though, if you do a project, you'll be choosing between the ITC and the PTC, and those are the rates that they will be at. I'm going to qualify that a little bit later. I'm saying pre-guidance through 2024 because on this first box on the left, that 30% ITC will be available immediately as soon as the bill passes. But then Treasury is going to issue regulations on labor, and if the labor parts of the bill make it through the bird process. When Treasury issues those regulations, we call it guidance. 60 days after that, the ITC at 30% will no longer be available. At that point, you'll be getting a 6% ITC. And then you'll get an additional 24%, bringing it up to 30 total if you meet those labor requirements. So any project, so if the bill passes, eventually Treasury will issue guidance. 60 days after that is when it changes. Any project that you start before that 60 days after Treasury issues guidance, you will be able to receive the full 30% ITC without meeting the labor requirements. That setup there applies to all solar projects over 1 megawatt. Solar projects under 1 megawatt will simply receive the 30% rate. I saw some questions here popping up on what are the labor requirements. I am going to get into that here in a little bit. But when we say pre-guidance through 2024, what we mean is after the period before Treasury issues regulations and before we drop down to that 6%, 24% construct, that's the way it'll last. Now, after that, so any time between now and 2024, you'll get 30%. After each Treasury does it, 60 days later, you'll be at the 60 and 6%, 24% construct. So after guidance comes out, like I said here in the middle, you'll only get a 6% base ITC and a 24% additional if you meet the labor requirements. If you choose the PTC for solar instead, you'll receive a 20% base PTC and then an additional 80% of the PTC. So you'll be getting 100% of the PTC if you meet the labor requirements. Again, so that's the time period between that middle part is the time period between after guidance comes out and the end of 2024 for any projects that start construction there. Now on January 1st, 2025, so about 2.5 years from now, there's a different construct. It's a new characterization of tax credits called tech neutral. But from the solar and storage perspective, really it's the same as the one I just described. The reason it's different is because other technologies that are emissions free that don't qualify for the ITC or PTC that perhaps aren't named for them right now will be able to qualify. So there could be new technologies here seeking to get tax credits. However, for us, for solar and storage, it's going to be the same. At that point, you'll get the 6% plus 24% or the 20% plus 80%. That in the legislation, the tech neutral lasts through the end of 2032 or when power sector emissions drop to 25% of 2022 levels, whichever is later. So they will last at least through 2032. And then at that point, there's a 3-year phase down. After 2032, there will be 100% of the tax credits values for 1 year, then 50%, and then gone. So you're looking at being phased out by 2035. So if you kind of take these things together, since for solar and storage and such, tech neutral really looks very much the same as the post guidance, we're really looking at 10 years plus of ITC, PTC extensions for the industry. I know there's a lot of questions here, and we are going to come back to them at the end. But can you keep flipping through the deck? Okay. Labor policy. After guidance comes out, 60 days later, if you want to receive the full ITC or PTC, you would need to meet labor policy, assuming that this makes it through the BIRD process and it's in the final bill that's passed into law. That labor policy for projects over 1 megawatt is paying prevailing wage on workers on a project and then meeting apprenticeship requirements. Those apprenticeship requirements are having a certain percentage of your workforce be apprentices, and then any contractor, whether there is where there's more than 4 employees, must have an apprentice as well. And then any additional sort of apprenticeship requirements that they may put forward that could come from the state. So there are on prevailing, well, the labor policies would be in effect during the time of your build. You would have to be paying prevailing wage and employing a certain number of apprenticeships from federally registered apprenticeship programs. And then when your build is complete and a project is placed in service, the prevailing wage requirements remain during a recapture period of a tax credit. So a solar project can be a tax credit could be recaptured during the 5 years after it's placed in service. So that's how long the prevailing wage requirements would be in place if you're taking the ITC. If you take the PTC for solar, the prevailing wage requirements stay in place for 10 years after. Those requirements on prevailing wage are just for alteration and repair. It does not appear to be for things like cutting the grass, you know, and some other things like that. It is for replacing panels, damage, updating your facility. That guidance from Treasury would need to be able to we'll spell that out in more detail. The apprenticeship requirements end when the project is placed in service. The policymakers didn't think it makes sense to have apprentices on sort of the small scale stuff that happens after a project is placed in service. On both of these, there are outs. By that, I mean, if you you know, make some sort of footfall errors and mistakes here, there is a way to rectify these so you don't lose your tax credit. All right, can we move on to the next slide? Okay. There are 3 sets of bonus credits for Section 48, and I am going to get to 25D, so folks know. There are bonus credits for domestic content, energy communities, and low-income allocated credit. If you meet domestic content requirements in the bill, you can get an extra 10% credit. So instead of a 30% ITC, you get a 40. If you place them in a defined number of energy communities, you can also get a 10% credit. So again, 40% instead of 30. If you did both of these, you get a 50% credit. And then there is a separate low-income allocated credit. The low-income allocated credit's a little bit different. In this case, it's not just that you place it in a defined number of low-income communities. In that case, the Treasury Department can issue permits for you to be able to install 1.8 gigawatts per year in 2023 and 2024 in low-income housing areas. It's allocated. What that means, you can't just build the project and get the credit. You would have to apply to the government to be able to receive the additional credit. The 10% credit is for low-income areas. The 20% credit is for sort of multifamily housing. And so that's a pretty substantial credit. But again, only 1.8 gigawatts per year is going to be able to build in 2023 and 2024. They'll be issuing some sort of they'll basically be issuing application process to do that. Let's go ahead and move on. Uh, 25D. This is no longer going to be called 25D in the bill, but that's how we all know it. By this, I mean the homeowner residential rooftop, where the rooftop owner takes the credit. This is extended through 2032. So you basically have a 10-year extension of the ITC at 30%. So there's a lot of these other sort of factors that are in there on the other credits are not there. Let's keep going. Okay, so this is manufacturing. I just want to add one last note. There's many other provisions in here. Storage is added to the ITC, which is really critical, both to Section 48 and to Section 25D. There's some minimums there that will definitely work for the industry. That's been a long time priority for SEIA, is to get standalone storage added to ITC, and that will absolutely be in there. There's also a whole host of home efficiency updates in there as well, which we'd be happy to go into more detail later. Okay, thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So I'll take the, I'm going to do a couple slides on manufacturing. One of the questions that we've gotten from the press since we had the announcement of the Inflation Reduction Act was, how do we know these manufacturing provisions are going to work? We know because we had a very significant role in developing them. SEIA has been working on manufacturing advocacy since 2018, when we first came up with the idea of creating a manufacturing division. Our board approved that in May of 2019. We then hosted a manufacturing summit in November of later that year. We also released our manufacturing white paper, and each of the manufacturing proposals that are included were referenced to some extent in that manufacturing white paper, in particular, the need for a suite of policy options or an industrial policy. We also, in June of 2021, when Senator Ossoff introduced the Solar Energy Manufacturing for America Act, or SEMA, set a goal of 50 gigawatts of domestic solar manufacturing capacity by 2030. And then most recently in spring of this year, we hosted a manufacturing forum where we also got input from folks. And then in the next week or two, we're going to issue a manufacturing roadmap, and Justin's going to preview that after my next slide. Next slide, please, Zach. So what does the IRA do for manufacturing? It does what we asked. It provides a suite of policy options. Some refer to that as industrial policy, but we've always said to help US manufacturing to be competitive, not only in the United States, but globally, we need a holistic approach. We need a three-legged stool. We need demand driver, long-term extension of the investment tax credit at 30%. That's in there, plus the two bonus credits that Jeremy referenced. In addition, you need CapEx support, because policy solutions are not one size fits all. A policy solution that may work for one segment of the industry may not be the most effective policy solution for another segment. So the 48C manufacturing tax credit, 30%, is in there, covers new facilities and equipment, critically important. And then finally, you need ongoing federal investments, incentives, support as our industry scales. There are significant gaps in our industry right now on domestic manufacturing. We don't make ingots, we don't make wafers, we don't make cells. We have very limited production of solar glass, limited production of trackers, limited production of inverters. And so a lot of these incentives are focused first and foremost on the key elements, filling those gaps, getting new module capacity, bolstering polysilicon manufacturing. But it's going to take time for companies to invest not only in those segments of the industry, but all of these supporting segments that will make the US solar manufacturing base competitive. And that's going to take time. It's a decade vision that we need here. And so the advanced production manufacturing credit is really critical to that. And then probably the most important validator for manufacturing is that companies have already said that with these incentives in place, they will invest in the US, are prepared to do so. And when this legislation passes, when it's signed into law, I think we believe you're going to very quickly see many new announcements of manufacturing commitments. We're aware of many right now, and I'm sure there are more out there. So if you haven't participated, if you're a manufacturer, you haven't participated in our manufacturing division, send me a note, send Amir Yazdi a note. We'll get you included in that group. Once this legislation is signed into law, there will be significant implementation, and we're going to need manufacturer support as to what works and what won't work as regulations are developed around this suite of policy options. I'd now like to turn to my colleague, Justin Baca, our Vice President of Market and Research, to talk about manufacturing going forward. Justin, next slide, please.
Thanks, John. Folks have been around the industry in the past year, or even really, for the past decade. We've had a number of disruptions to our supply chains, and those challenges have been particularly acute over the past, let's say, 9 months or so. So, that on top of a number of other priorities has really increased our interest in seeing the reshoring of solar manufacturing. And we need to de-risk our supply chains and make sure that what we're getting is something is reliable and something we feel good about. So the provisions in this bill will help that happen. But it'll require a few things. So John alluded to a few of those. There's the tax credits for production facilities. There's also the production credits. So these would be credits doled out in dollars per kilogram of polysilicon actually produced, dollars per square meter of wafers produced, dollars per watt of cells, and dollars per watt of modules, or rather in cents per watt for cells and modules. And these things will help close the gap that makes and make domestic manufacturing cost competitive, on top of the bonus available in the core ITC for projects that meet certain minimum domestic content requirements. Now, the other thing that's essential is that domestic manufacturers have domestic demand to sell to. And so that's why having the extension of the ITC is very important at the same time. If we didn't grow the downstream industry, there wouldn't be a lot for domestic manufacturers to sell into. Now, it's important to think about how we get from where we are now to where we want to be in a few years. And of course, you can't just snap your fingers and have a factory come online overnight. It's going to take 2 to 3 years to get some factories online. So sort of the earlier, simpler ones to do would be module factories, tracker factories, inverters, backsheet, and glass. But if you start looking at further upstream stuff for the module supply chain, metallurgical grade silicon, ingot and wafer facilities, and cell facilities, those are all going to take 3 to 5 years to get online. And it could take, a little while to get existing domestic polysilicon factories restarted. That could probably happen a little faster than domestic ingot and wafer. But we've got, about 20 gigawatts worth of domestic polysilicon capacity. And if we're going to get more significant volumes, we're going to have to either expand those factories or build new ones. But let's look at some other considerations here. So if you move forward to the next slide, we have a 2-year pause on new tariffs on imports from Southeast Asia in the event that Commerce provides a positive determination in the current anti-circumvention investigation. That means we have to try to get as much done as we can between now and then. Now, we believe that case is meritless, but we have to be prepared. So we could conceivably have new module manufacturing capacity up and running by the end of that tariff pause. However, it's probably not going to be enough time for us to get new cell manufacturing capacity online here in the US. So in the time between when we can have a new module manufacturing capacity and new cell capacity, we're going to have to backfill with imports for a while. So that means, if we start building everything out in the US, because there are a number of companies that have started making tentative plans based on their hope that these provisions would become law. If they were to start executing on those plans in the fourth quarter of this year, we could have new production capacity online for modules by the end of the 24-month period, but we'd have a year where we have to import cells, and probably a little time after that, 6 months to a year, where we'd still have to import wafers to feed those cell factories. And so this is just very important that we keep in mind how long it's going to take to build out the supply chain, so that as policymakers and economic development agencies are considering incentive packages or build out in their jurisdictions, that they're going to have to be prepared for backfilling with imports for some time before their domestic options are available. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide here. Just to give an idea of how much impact this is going to have, we did do an analysis, this will be in our white paper, of what domestic manufacturing is likely to look like under current policy, and what it's likely to look like if this bill becomes law. So in the current policy, we're not likely to see much beyond what is currently announced, where we have sort of limited domestic crystalline silicon module and thin film module capacity, a small amount of inverter production, and perhaps some polysilicon production back online. Versus what we'll see if this is expanded, we'll see probably over 50 gigawatts worth of domestic manufacturing. Now, what's important to note here is that 50 gigawatts is more than we're expected to install under current policy. Under current policy, we would only get to less than 40 gigawatts per year in 2030. with the provisions in this bill, we expect that demand could be well over 70 gigawatts per year in 2030. So you don't get to over 50 gigawatts of domestic manufacturing without much more domestic demand to support those factories. And so that's just a really critical piece. We've got to make sure the downstream industry is healthy. We've got to make sure the upstream industry is healthy. They're both critical to having a fully healthy domestic solar industry. So it's really a great sign. If we get this over the finish line again, click on the link, first item in the chat there to take action, help make sure this comes to fruition. And with that, I think I'll toss it back to Aaron.
Thank you, Justin. I'll take over from here.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Bolden, the Director of Congressional Affairs here at SEIA, and I will be talking about some of the broad grants and loan programs focused on through the environmental justice aspect. Next slide, please. So in the bill, the environmental and climate justice block grants, this bill has provisions that include $3 billion for block grants for environmental justice projects for disadvantaged communities. Eligible projects include those that address environmental harms in low-income and disadvantaged communities related to pollution, monitoring, investment in zero emissions infrastructure, transportation emissions reduction, climate resiliency, pollution prevention, and deployment of low and zero emissions energy technologies. The structure and administration of this block grant will need to be further defined through the EPA's regulatory process. In addition to these benefits, this bill establishes a high efficiency electric home rebate program, which will provide grants to state energy offices to grant rebates for a host of electrification upgrades. Next slide, please. DOE Loan Program Office. First, there is $40 billion in additional commitment authority, with some exceptions, including national interest transmission corridor projects. Loan guarantees now require presidential certification that the project is not receiving other federal funding or assistance. New is $250 billion commitment authority for projects that retool, repower, and repurpose or replace electricity or fossil fuel infrastructure that has ceased operations or enable operating infrastructure to avoid, reduce, utilize, or sequester air pollutants or greenhouse gases. These terms are limited to 30 years. Next slide, please. Transmission loans. There is $2 billion for loans to non-federal entities for constructing new electric transmission facilities in designated national interest corridors. The loan can't exceed 80% of the cost of the project and can't be subordinate to other financing, and is limited to a term that is less of 90% of the project's life or 30 years. Grants to facilitate the siting of interstate electricity transmission lines. There are $760 million for the Department of Energy to issue grants to state, local, or tribal entities for studying covered transmission projects and hire and carrying out related economic development and regulatory proceedings. Funding is contingent on the transmission project being approved, or in the case of non-permitting entity, commencement of construction. Next slide, please. Solar right-of-way restrictions. For a period of 10 years post-enactment, the Department of Interior is prohibited from issuing a solar right-of-way on onshore federal lands unless Interior has held an onshore oil and gas lease sale in previous 120 days, at which the lesser of 2 million acres or 50% of acreage for which expressions of interest have been submitted or offered. $150 million for additional hiring of Interior personnel for project review and permitting. And lastly, the Department of Agriculture programs, including REAP, additional $1 billion for rural renewable energy electrification loans and expansion of the program to include storage. Additionally, $1 billion for REAP with total grants limiting to 50% of the total cost of an eligible project. And lastly, $9.6 billion for loans and financing for rural co-ops to purchase renewable energy generation, zero emission systems, and related transmission, limited to 25% of total costs. And I believe that is the last slide that I will be presenting. Thank you all.
Yes, thanks, Charles. And we are all going to now move into Q&A. So I'll invite my panelists to turn their cameras on. In addition to the experts that you just heard from, we are joined by 3 additional experts who have helped us walk through this legislation. Ben Norris, who is the Senior Director of Federal Affairs and Regulatory. He is a lawyer. James Dennis, who's our consultant on tax, President of Rock Creek Council, and Alex McDonough, who is a principal at Pioneer Public Affairs and is an advisor to us on the politics of the United States Senate, among other things. So in addition to that, we'll be joined by Jeremy, John, Justin, and Charles. All right, so first question, Jeremy, we have heard a lot and we worked really hard on direct pay for both Section 48 and 25D. That did not make it into the final bill, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about that outcome and what's in the bill in terms of flexibility around tax equity.
Sure. So direct pay is in the bill in a very limited way. If you are a state or local government, if you are a Indian tribe, if you are an Alaska Native corporation, or if you are a nonprofit entity, then you can receive direct pay for the technologies in the bill. There's 2 technologies that you can receive direct pay for even if you are not one of those entities. And that is and you can see Senator Manchin's fingerprints on the bill here. That's for carbon capture and for hydrogen. And we do know that some solar companies are engaged in the hydrogen world. So you could receive that sort of regardless of who you are. There is a provision in the bill on transferability, which is something new. And again, all this stuff, we'll have to see what makes it through the BIRD process. I know I said that earlier, but it bears repeating. The transferability would allow someone who takes a tax credit to transfer the credit to another taxpayer. So if, ABC Solar Company gets a credit, they wanted to be able to monetize it, they could go to, I don't know, Safeway or Google or something and say, I'll transfer the credit to you, you make a cash payment for it, and then I'll use that for the cost of building my project. You can only transfer to other corporate entities, not to individuals. But that's a new proposal that's in the bill there. We'll see if it makes it through to the end.
Great, thanks so much, Jeremy. And before we let you go, I am hoping you can shed some light on what the bill includes for community solar projects. As Charles indicated, there's a huge focus around environmental justice and sort of democratization around participating in climate solutions and making more clean energy available to more Americans, and community solar is obviously a huge part on that. Can you talk a little bit about those provisions, please?
Sure. Well, some community solar projects could be done in low-income areas. And as I mentioned, there is the allocated 1.8 gigawatts a year in 2023 and 2024 at a 10%, at a 20% rate. I'm happy to send the specific links where they list the very specific criteria for qualifying for either of those 2 allocated credits. Additionally, there is, I think something that would impact a lot of community solar projects and others is the interconnection cost provision that SEIA secured in the bill. That provision would cover, for the first time, you'd be able to, for projects 5 megawatts and below AC, you'd be able to have the interconnection costs part of your project also applicable to the ITC. So when a utility says you're going to pay X to connect this to the grid, just use a number, 500,000 or something like that, that 500,000 you could apply to the ITC. So if the ITC rates at 30%, you get the 30% of it back. That's an effort to ease congestion and address some cost concerns. So hopefully that's quite significant for sub 5 megawatt projects.
Great, thanks so much. This next question, I'm going to turn to Ben. As Charles outlined, there is some solar right-of-way changes, and particularly on federal lands. This has received a lot of press over the last 24 hours. I was on a press call yesterday where I think like 80% of the questions were about this particular provision. I know you have taken a really deep dive into this and are familiar with the current regulatory regime around this, and I wonder if you could offer a little bit more specifics around that, please.
Sure, happy to, Aaron. So the provision you're referring to, I think, can be viewed as a limitation potentially on the issuance of new onshore solar rights of way. It's tied to sort of two aspects of BLM's onshore oil and gas leasing program, and basically says that BLM has to hit sort of two milestones before it can issue any solar right of way. So those two restrictions are based on looking back at what BLM has done over a couple of different time periods. So the first restriction is, number one, we're not going to issue you a solar right of way unless in the 120 days prior to issuing you the solar right of way, BLM has conducted at least one onshore oil and gas lease sale. The second restriction is for the past year, going back from the date of issuance of the solar right of way, has BLM offered at least the lesser of 2 million acres for oil and gas leasing, or 50% of the parcels for which the oil and gas industry has expressed interest. We don't view these two restrictions as significantly limiting the right-of-way issuance process for a couple of reasons. One, even though there was some, concern at the beginning of the Biden administration about the onshore oil and gas leasing pause, that pause has been lifted. In fact, it was set aside by a federal court. Other court decisions and recent BLM guidance make very clear now that that BLM is required to hold regular lease sales, right? The second reason we don't have a lot of concerns about sort of the volume of leasing that's going to happen in any given year is based on historical practice. So if you look at the last decade from 2009 to 2019 of how many parcels have been offered for lease, the number of parcels has exceeded 2 million every single one of those years. The only sort of exception year would be 2020 due to COVID and sort of demand destruction on the oil and gas side under the previous administration. In 2021, even though BLM didn't hit that 2 million acre threshold, they did hit the 50% threshold. So that 2 million acreage is an upper limit and not an absolute or a minimum. So for those reasons, we anticipate that solar rights of way will still be able to be issued in a timely and predictable fashion. But it is something to keep an eye on in terms of future administrations, whether or not the sort of oil and gas leasing program kind of continues apace. I would also note that this restriction is only going to last for 10 years. So once we're beyond a decade post enactment, that restriction goes away.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I do want to come back and remind everyone, if it has not sunk in yet, that everything we're talking about is contingent on this bill passing. So we need everyone to take that action that's in the chat and share that link widely. We have some questions about the domestic content adder. Jeremy, if you could speak to the 2% versus 10% piece as in the current bill or the current draft of the bill, that would be helpful. Some just additional clarity around that.
Sure. So the intention of the drafters is to try to put the labor provisions and everything above 1 megawatt. That includes the adders. And so you don't just get a 10% adder, you get 20% of that additional 10%, and then you get the full additional 10% if you're also meeting the labor conditions. So let's say you have a 6% base ITC and you meet all the domestic content provisions, you're only getting an additional 2%, that's that. But if you have a 6% base ITC, then you met the labor provisions, that takes you up to 30%. Then if you also meet the domestic content provision, and because you're already meeting the labor conditions that took you up to 30, then you're getting the full 40%.
Thank you. This next question is for John. Thank you so much for covering the manufacturing piece. I wonder if you could talk about the development of that legislation. I know that SEIA was deeply involved in helping to get this off the ground. And if you could just give us a little bit more flavor around how we landed where we are today in this transformative policy.
Yeah, so really it started with, I mean, it all kind of flows from the manufacturing division, where we had a core group of companies. We put out our white paper in 2019 with these ideas. And then through that group, it really winnowed down, what is it going to take to have robust manufacturing? There were some segments of the manufacturing base that said, 48C, that would be great. That 30% CapEx would help us. Others that said, we have the money to make the investment in the facility, but once that facility is built, we're going to be selling product in a hyper competitive global market. And so ongoing production support is going to be more helpful for us. And then everybody agreeing that you need a demand driver, that 10-year demand signal, is so critically important. So, and then working through Jeremy and the Senate Finance, and just really having our congressional affairs team work with Senate Finance on details, and a lot of back and forth with our manufacturing members is how we got there. Again, once this becomes a law, which is, we're very optimistic that it will, but a lot of work to do to get there. Implementation is really going to be critically important. And all of these manufacturing provisions are going to be run through our manufacturing division, where we hear from the manufacturers directly as to what's needed in the implementation of these proposals.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, John. I want to talk a little bit about how the process here. Abby alluded to some pretty significant work that we have all engaged in over the last year and a half, but particularly over the last several weeks. And I just want to take a point of personal privilege to talk about the relationships that we have built as an industry across the clean energy sector, and that includes with unions. As Jeremy outlined, there are very significant labor provisions here that we have been working on for a long time to make sure that they are operational for companies for which they are applicable. But I also want to acknowledge that getting to this place took a lot of partnerships and coalition building, and tapping into existing power structures outside of the clean energy space. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of coalitions and partnerships were built with the assistance of folks not on this call, within SEIA and within our companies. And we see a ton of questions here about exactly how those provisions are going to be implemented. I mean, obviously there is still guidance that needs to be released, as well as regulations and adjustments. But I just want to acknowledge how important that has been in this outcome that we have seen, and the fact that we're even at this place right now presenting a possible deal to all of you on this webinar is a testament to that hard work. So I do want to acknowledge many of the folks on this panel, especially Alex and James and the rest of our congressional and SEIA team for that work. So just wanted to say a word that we have really expanded the circle in terms of who we work with in the clean energy space. And I think that's incredibly significant for building our political power. We probably have time for like one more question. And I do want to say, this is just a foretaste of what's coming. If we are successful in passing this legislation with the help of all of you for taking action and reaching out to your elected officials, we will obviously be rewriting our tax guidance for sure, and offering additional education opportunities on each individual piece. We could have an entire webinar series on each piece of this legislation, and we would welcome that opportunity to do so once this is passed and signed into law. Let's see if there's I think with that, well, let's just see. I'm just scanning the questions really quickly to see if there's any last piece. And then I think with that, we can turn it back to our fearless leader, Abby Hopper, to wrap us up. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Awesome. Great team. Two things. One, I'm going to, Zach, are we sharing the slides and the video? That seemed to be a frequently asked question.
Yeah, we'll have that ready early next week.
Okay, so you guys will get this if you didn't commit it all to memory. And second, apologies if you mentioned this, but I just saw it come up over and over again. Asking the impossible, timing on guidance.
I will take that one. I think it depends on A, when it passes. B, we have had numerous discussions already through this drafting process with our friends at IRS and Treasury. We are in regular contact with them. And we have already asked Treasury how long it will take. And they're going to be moving as quickly as possible, but we just don't know. And they won't tell us. So we will let you know as soon as we hear news.
Great, thank you. And Chris Carmody, I just saw your question. You can share these slides. We don't anticipate on a webinar with over 500 people that whatever was on those slides is going to remain confidential. And there's nothing confidential on them. It's good information to share. Thank you for asking. I noticed when we had our team of experts up there that y'all look a lot alike. And I just want to acknowledge that our team is actually much more diverse than this webinar shows, and that we need that diversity. We need all voices at the table, and that continues to be a critical personal and professional goal of mine. So know that there are lots of hands doing this work, and these are just a few of the faces. So I'm going to repeat what I said at the beginning: stay in the fight. If you know me, you know I love Peloton, and that's what Kendall Toole always says. Stay in the fight. But we are not done. We are not done. We are not ending 2022 with a press release, okay? We're going to end 2022 with a piece of legislation signed by the President of the United States. That's the actual goal, okay? So stay alert for more information. Pass the word to people that care about the health of our industry and the health of our planet, and take action basically as we ask you to. With that, I want to just offer huge thanks to my team. They are fearless and ferocious advocates on your behalf. They're also a tired bunch of advocates on your behalf, but totally worth it, completely and totally worth it. So thank you all. We will see you soon. And we do look forward to celebrating with you when we work together to get this done. Bye all.